Welcome to Worship at Home in the Northampton Circuit. Most people like a good love story, and the Book of Ruth has got all the ingredients. Young girl meets young man, and they marry. But tragedy strikes. The young man, his father, and his brother all die. But eventually, there's happiness, aided and abetted by a scheming mother-in-law. But it must be more than a good story to have been included in Scripture. There must be an important message for its readers. Israel had experienced a famine, and Elimelech and Naomi, who were living in Bethlehem, decided to move to the neighboring country of Moab. It was a country steeped in heathen practices, and they took with them their 2 sons. The boys eventually married girls from Moab, Orpah and Ruth. But then disaster struck. First, Elimelech died, and later both his sons died too, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. She hears that things have improved back in Israel, so she decides to return. She encourages her daughters-in-law to stay in their homeland and find themselves new husbands. Being a widow was a very vulnerable position to be in. And both girls decide they'll go with Naomi. Orpah did eventually stay in Moab, but Ruth was adamant she wanted to be with Naomi, and she wanted to put her faith in Naomi's God. Her words have become quite famous. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. They returned to Israel, poor, with no means of support, and no husbands to care for and protect them. Ruth was also a foreigner from a land which had been at war with Israel. Starvation for them was a real possibility. But under the religious laws of the Israelite people, anyone who had fallen on hard times had to be provided for. There was a law that reapers in the field should leave a portion of the crop to be collected by the needy. If they missed a bit, they were not to go back to it. It was harvest time, and so Ruth was able to glean a little food from the fields. And this is the first message of the story. Concern for the poor and underprivileged is shown to be part of the nature of God. Before long, the field's owner, Boaz, noticed Ruth. He sent for her and told her, "I've heard marvelous things you've done for your mother-in-law." But Boaz knew it was useless just wishing someone well and doing nothing about it. So he told his foreman to make sure that bundles of corn were accidentally left on the field for her to glean. This is the second message of the story. Simply that God expects us to translate our good intentions into actions, expressed by the giving of our talents, our time, and possessions to those less fortunate than ourselves. Boaz demonstrates this by going far beyond what the law required of him in his generosity. For us too, God's provision often comes through the generosity of others. We, in our turn, are to bless others by our generosity. We have a responsibility to keep the momentum of love going. Naomi told Ruth not to stray from the field owned by Boaz. She was quick to recognize him. He was a close relative of her late husband. Now, a close relative in those times was expected to marry a widow and provide for her on behalf of the deceased husband. thereby redeeming her from poverty. This brings me to the final message in our story. It points forward to the time of the great Redeemer, Jesus Christ. When Christ died on the cross, he redeemed us. He brought back those of us who were lost, not just by paying money or giving possessions, but literally paying with his life. He made it possible for those in sin's slavery to be freed and returned to God's family. Jesus is the supreme example of a redeemer. Just as Ruth was brought into her new family by the generous act of a relative, so we too are set free and adopted into God's family. How great is that? There is one final twist to the story that I had not known about. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, and Jesus was of David's line, which means she was a direct ancestor of Jesus. Isn't that marvelous?